Well, good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for coming today. As you know, my name is Tom Lupton. I'm the head of social studies here at Shawnigan Lake School, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to Shawnigan Lake School's 6th annual Holocaust and Genocide Symposium. Before we begin today, however, I'd like to introduce our headmaster, Mr. David Robertson, to say a few words.
Good morning, everyone. A particularly warm welcome on a day like this is needed, and I'm sure it's happening. I would just like to take a couple of minutes to officially welcome our guests, Professor Jones and Kathy from the Vancouver Holocaust Education Centre. Great to have you, and in one case I think it's first time, and back. Yeah, there we go. So. It's been a couple of weeks of what I would call increased learning, and I think you'll know what I'm talking about. At all times in life and in school, there are important things to learn. We know that. Sometimes there are really important things to learn. And I think in this last couple of weeks, when we had our post-cabaret, the musical discussions and presentations, and then the whole anti-bullying presentations that took place last Tuesday and so on. There are elements of the way people treat each other and their essential humanity that are so crucial. And some of those elements are right at the heart of what you're going to learn about and focus on in the course of today. We cannot ever underestimate, in my book anyway, we cannot ever underestimate the importance of the learning in this whole area of, well, I'll stop there. This whole area, let's leave it there. But again, with that said, it's my great pleasure to welcome our special guests and to welcome you all to what I think will be an intense but incredibly rewarding day. Thank you.
Thank you very much, David. Those are perfect words to start today. This event has been organized in partnership with the Vancouver Holocaust Education Centre and is supported by Zev Shafran, who is an alumni of Shawnigan Lake School from 1974, and his family. The Holocaust Education Centre and the Vancouver Island community are grateful for the initiative of Mr. Roland Borsato, the Director of Alumni Relations at Shawnigan, whose idea it was initially to launch this symposium and this program. The Vancouver Holocaust Education Centre was founded by survivors from the Holocaust who wanted to leave a permanent legacy to the citizens of British Columbia in the form of a Holocaust-based anti-racism education centre. That the centre fulfills its mandate, which is to promote social justice, human rights, and genocide awareness through the education and remembrance of the Holocaust, with events just like this one in districts all around the province, is testament to the founder's vision and of the enduring significance of the Holocaust. As the promise of never again is broken time and time again, we turn to the Holocaust for navigational points on the moral compasses we use as individuals, as nations, and as global citizens. It was the Holocaust, after all, that has provided much of the language that we use for conceptualizing genocide, for commemorating genocide, and for the pursuit of justice in its aftermath. The agenda for this morning's event is outlined in the programs that you've got. We will begin with a historical address from Dr. Adam Jones, and he'll be providing us with a framework from which we can think about the rest of the day. After the refreshment break, you will have the remarkable opportunity to meet an eyewitness of the Holocaust, Lilian Borax-Nemetz. This will be followed by a panel discussion, which is a tremendously important part of the program, in which you will be able to ask questions directly of the Holocaust survivor and the historian. The remainder of the day will be split into breakout groups by grade, and you will hear from a residential school survivor, Mr. Alex Nelson, Professor Charlotta Charlie, and Dr. Adam Jones as well. Some homework. Please put your full name and grade on your program right now, as you'll be expected to take notes and hand these in following the symposium. So if you wouldn't mind taking a minute to do that right now, that would be great. So to learn about topics like genocide and Holocaust is never easy. It sort of asks us to grasp with the darker side of human history. So today isn't going to be an easy day. It's going to be a full day, but it won't be easy. Importantly, it's not going to be a day that you're likely to forget either. To learn about genocide is to take on crucial questions about what it means to be human from historical, philosophical, legal, theological, and ethical lenses. To help us grapple with these really difficult questions, it is my great pleasure to introduce you Dr. Adam Jones. Dr. Adam Jones is a professor of political science at the University of British Columbia, Okanagan. He's the author of the widely used textbook Genocide, A Comprehensive Introduction, and the author or editor of more than a dozen other books on genocide and crimes against humanity, gender and international politics, and transitional mass media. He was recently selected as one of the 50 key thinkers on the Holocaust and genocide, and has worked as an expert consultant with the United Nations Office of Genocide Prevention. Dr. Jones has lived or traveled in over 100 different countries worldwide, and is also a widely published photojournalist. And in your bio, you can see a link where you can have a look at some of his photographs. So ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Dr. Jones.
And if we could just move the presentation up there. That's great, and I'll try to keep track of time here. Thank you very much, and to all those at Shawnigan Lake School who've invited me to address you this morning. It's always a pleasure to be in front of a crowd of young people like yourselves, and I look out and see the future of genocide studies and the future of genocide prevention when I look at the new generation emerging at this rather complex and fraught moment in our history. As someone who's been working on genocide studies for about the last 20 years, I think there was a kind of easy optimism at a certain point about 10 years ago that we were on a kind of constant upward curve, that humanity had finally recognized the atrocity of the targeting of minority groups, and through various instruments at the national level and the international level was meaningfully confronting this crime for the first time. Looking at the events of the last several years, we see something of a hitch in that nice optimistic scenario. I think we are entering a difficult and complex period in the Western world and around the world, characterized, among other things, by the resurgence of some of the cultural and social and political patterns that we connect with genocides in the past, such as nationalism and exclusivism and xenophobia, and a desire in many ways to retrench rather than be open and inclusive to the outside world and to suffering and vulnerable populations worldwide. It's hard to see where that trajectory, how that trajectory is going to play out in the next few years, but all of you here today will be significant parts of that, and I think each of you, as I hope we will explore more in the breakout sessions, has an individual role to play in ensuring that some of the progress and some of the advances that we have made since roughly the Second World War in naming and understanding and confronting the crime of genocide and the related legal category of crimes against humanity, in helping to ensure that that does continue on a broadly upward trajectory. So I hope that this day will be valuable to you in analyzing and understanding some of your own perspectives on this issue, on this history. You have the extraordinary opportunity today to listen to individual survivors of genocide, which is not a perspective, fortunately for me, that I am able to present to you. What I'd like to do instead is to talk a little bit about the emergence of this concept, to introduce you to the one person who is most responsible for coining the concept of genocide and entrenching it in international law. To go over briefly something of the emergence of this field of genocide studies and 2 or 3 of the so-called canonical cases of genocide that we tend to look at, including the Jewish Holocaust, but ranging beyond it. And then I'd like to close with some consideration of the underpinning psychological dimensions of genocide, which I hope we can use to guide some of our understanding and discussion in the breakout sessions and beyond that. So, there is the word. It is arguably the most powerful word in the English language, and possibly a few other languages as well. There are very few words in our lexicon that I think evoke the same sense of shock and concern as does the word genocide. And some of you may not be aware that this is a relatively recent word. It was coined towards the end of the Second World War. It was invented precisely to shock you, precisely to galvanize your attention. And it was invented by this otherwise rather obscure gentleman named Raphael Lemkin. I'd like to talk briefly about the story of Lemkin because I think it is a testimony, among other things, to the role that a single individual can play in human history. And worth keeping that in mind if the topic of genocide seems so overwhelming that you wonder, how could I as one person ever make a difference? Lemkin was afflicted by much that same sense of frustration and helplessness, and instead of retiring into passivity, he decided instead to stage an intervention which we are still reckoning with and which I think has served to draw attention to a category of crimes that go very deeply back in human history and indeed in human nature. Lemkin was a Polish citizen of Jewish ethnicity and religion. He grew up in a town in Poland which is now in the country of Belarus. And from a very early age, he had a precocious interest in human history, and as he learned more about it, the vulnerability of particularly national minorities and religious groups. He had a very interesting family, particularly a mother who constantly pressed upon him books and novels about history, and he read at a very early age a novel called Quo Vadis, which deals with the persecution of the Christians under the Roman Empire. And this seems to have been his introduction to the specific targeting of vulnerable minority populations throughout history. In his youth, he attended the University of Lvov, then in Poland, now in Western Ukraine. You can visit Lvov, now called Lviv, as I did a couple of years ago, and track down some of Lemkin's old haunts there. He started off as a linguistics student, but he also had an abiding interest in the law. And a conversation that he had with his law professor in 1921 was in the immediate wake of World War I and an event that I'll mention in slightly greater detail shortly, the Armenian Genocide. And at that time, there was a young Armenian man named Soghomon Tehlirian who was on trial in Germany for tracking down one of the architects of the Armenian genocide against his own people and assassinating him in broad daylight on the streets of Berlin. He was then put on trial for murder. As an interesting footnote, he was eventually acquitted by the jury, who felt that he had been so traumatized by the fate of his family in the Armenian genocide that he was not morally responsible for his actions. But Lemkin, as this trial is going on, is speaking with one of his law professors and does something that I think people who make these kind of innovative interventions in history often do. He asked the question, why? And the particular question that he was curious about is, okay, Sogomon Tehlirian is on trial for murder. Murder is considered the most destructive and serious crime in most societies, attracting the greatest penalty. But there was no mechanism to put on trial the person whom Tehlirian had as a vigilante assassinated and the other key leaders of the Armenian genocide. And he asked his professor, law professor, why is this? And his professor responded, well, Raphael, that's just the way the world works. Governments have sovereignty over their own territory and can apply their laws, but there is nothing internationally that can stop a sovereign government from launching campaigns of terror and persecution and mass killing against members or groups in their own population. Lemkin goes away from that conversation. He records this later in his autobiography, thinking to himself, quote unquote, this is most inconsistent, says Lemkin. And in that sense of inconsistency, in that sense of something missing in legal frameworks nationally and internationally, we get the birth of this idea of genocide and of Lemkin's determination to entrench it in international law. Now, to make a very long story short, he switches his specialty to law, and during the 1930s, he is experimenting with a vocabulary to try to convey the nature of these campaigns against vulnerable minority groups. The first two terms that he comes up with are barbarity and vandalism. And he's using those to refer to both physical violence and atrocities against members of targeted groups, and vandalism against their property, against their cultural legacy, against their language, and so on. The words don't really find much purchase in the Europe of the 1930s. This is a time with some of the same dark clouds that we see on our horizon today: growing nationalism, growing xenophobia. There is very little international will to come together to ban a category of atrocity crimes, as Lemkin is asking the world to do. What changes things is the Second World War, and particularly Nazi genocide, preeminently, certainly in our understanding of the Nazis, the Holocaust against the Jews, who were the only population singled out for total destruction and extermination by the Nazi occupiers. Lemkin very nearly becomes a victim of the Holocaust, but he is able to leverage some legal connections that allow him to escape Poland ahead of the Nazi invaders. He takes refuge, first of all, in Sweden, and then on a circuitous journey finds his way all the way over to the west coast of North America, and finally settles on the East Coast at Yale University and Duke University. He has to leave behind most of his extended family, which does not take as seriously as he does the Nazi threat, and indeed more than 50 of Lemkin's family members were murdered in the Jewish Holocaust, including his parents, whom he had to leave behind as he went to the States. So he is tormented for the remainder of the war by a sensation of guilt, first of all, in his thoughts of having abandoned his family to their fate at the Nazis' hands. And he returns to his framework about the need to establish a new category of crimes that will banish once and for all the impunity that nation states have to commit these kind of atrocities against subject populations. And in 1943, as he's working on his only completed book in his lifetime, it's called Axis Rule in Occupied Europe, he comes up with the word genocide. And it's what we call a neologism, a newly invented word. He takes the Greek root genos, meaning race or tribe, and combines that with the Latin suffix cide, side, that we are familiar with from homicide, suicide, etc., killing or destruction. And he's inspired, incidentally, to choose this word by, of all things, the Kodak camera. You may remember cameras. They were these things that we had back before cell phones. The Kodak was for him a beautifully branded product. He said, when you think of a Kodak, the only thing you can think of is a camera. He wanted to brand genocide in the same way. He wanted to create a marketing tool. He was very open about this, a word that would galvanize attention and catalyze the kind of international and global project that could make this crime a vestige of the past. Now, if you look at Lemkin's original formulation of genocide from Axis Rule in Occupied Europe, published in 1944, you may see that it is a little different from the standard or traditional understanding of genocide as we have it today. Lemkin talks about a coordinated plan of different actions aimed at destroying the essential foundations of the life of national groups with the aim of annihilating the groups themselves. And then he goes on to talk about the disintegration of the group's political and social institutions, its culture, language, national feeling, religion, economic existence. These are all things that don't necessarily first leap to our minds when we think of the word that he invented, and then talks about this process of destruction as being an assault on the personal security, liberty, health, dignity, and even the lives of the individuals belonging to such groups. I think, among other things, this is the most eloquent single passage in the whole history of genocide studies. It's a beautifully crafted definition, but it's one that is in some ways at variance with our understanding of what genocide today is, particularly in that it focuses on cultural and sociological destruction, on the destruction of the bonds of identity and solidarity among group members, so that even if you do not physically kill members of the group, for Lemkin, it is enough that the group's internal cohesion and capacity to reproduce itself as a civilizational unit, if you like, is what is being undermined and destroyed in that sense. And ever since this time, there's been a big debate in genocide studies over what is the nature of genocidal destruction. Does it involve physical killing or at least large-scale physical damage and injury to populations? Or should the focus be more on this cultural and sociological dimension of group identity and cohesion? What happens between 1944 and 1948 is a remarkable thing in the history of the 20th century and in the history of international law. Lemkin almost single-handedly, and then increasingly with a few key allies in the emerging body of the United Nations, takes the opportunity, seizes the opportunity of this critical moment after the Second World War, where the scale of Nazi crimes, above all, is finally becoming apparent to the outside world as the death camps are liberated, as we start to see these images of mass graves being filled with bodies by bulldozers. There is a pervasive sense of shock and a pervasive sense of the catchphrase that we've used in genocide studies ever since: never again. Never again must this be allowed to happen. And as a result, because this is a uniquely propitious historical moment, Lemkin is able to influence the United Nations and its early membership to actually craft a legal document and an international convention that bans the crime. Remember, this is a crime that he had only named 4 years previously. I think that's quite extraordinary, that a concept goes from being coined to 4 years later being enshrined in one of the major instruments of international human rights law. We could spend the rest of the day talking about the United Nations Genocide Convention. It's a remarkable document, and it's an ambiguous document in many ways. But if you take a look at the definition there on the screen, you can see a couple of things going on that I think are particularly relevant. You can see in Article 1 that the contracting parties to the convention undertake to prevent and to punish the crime of genocide. And in the preamble, it is stated, this is important, that genocide is a crime that has afflicted humanity at all stages of human history. So although the Nazi crimes of the Second World War were the immediate catalyst for this body of legislation, the framing of the Genocide Convention is a global historical one. And that in itself reflects Lemkin's own understanding of genocide. He was a meticulous scholar of world history. He carried the story of genocide well back into the prehistoric past and argued that it was a deeply entrenched feature of human affairs. This, too, we see reflected in the Genocide Convention. Unfortunately, the convention does not tell us, whether as individuals or nation states, exactly how we are supposed to prevent and punish genocide. Probably because that would have been a very sticky issue to get into, with a lot of states particularly concerned about preserving their national sovereignty and freedom from outside interference. So it was declaratory in extent. Let's prevent this, let's punish it, but we're not going to tell you exactly how. And ever since, concerned individuals and states have been working to try to figure out what is the range of appropriate prevention and intervention strategies for this crime. Article 2 is the crux of the Genocide Convention, and word for word, this is still the definition of genocide under international law. So if you have heard of the International Criminal Court, for example, genocide is one of the crimes with which it is charged to intervene, and it simply takes the Genocide Convention definition without changing a single word. So with all of its issues and problems, this is the legal definition that we are still working with. Genocide means any of the following acts committed with intent to destroy, in whole or in part, a national, ethnical, this sort of antiquated word for ethnic, racial, or religious group as such. We could spend the rest of the day just talking about that sentence. What is meant by destroy? What is meant by intent to destroy? How do you show intent when perpetrators generally are not exactly advertising what they're doing or owning up to it. In whole or in part, what part of a group, how substantial a part of a group, needs to be targeted in order to qualify as genocide? Not clarified. A national, ethnical, racial, or religious group. Well, keep in mind that since 1948, concepts like race and ethnicity that were pretty much taken for granted back then are seen as being somewhat more complicated and fraught concepts today. Many people would argue that there is in fact no such thing as race. And so people are prosecuted for genocide not so much based on the integral characteristics and identity of the group that they're targeting, but the characteristics and identity that they impute to the group. So let's say, for example, in the Rwanda genocide, you have groups of Tutsi and Hutu, and by none of the traditional characteristics can you distinguish those two as racial groups. What you can say is that the Hutu perpetrators of the genocide against the Tutsis did consider the Tutsis to be ethnically and racially different from them and sought to destroy them as such. And to that extent, we have been able to bring successful prosecutions for genocide, even in a context where racial identity is rather limited. But a further question needs to be asked here. Why only these four groups? National, ethnic, racial, and religious. They are still the only four protected groups under the Genocide Convention, and many advocates and scholars of genocide, like myself, are concerned to expand this framework to other categories of human groups. I do a lot of work around gender and genocide, and I think gender groups really need to be understood as among those targeted. Political groups were left out of the designation, but we know from the history of mass atrocity since this time that it's very often groups of an imputed political identification that are targeted first and worst in campaigns of mass repression. And also social classes, the poor, the rich. Under Joseph Stalin in the USSR, there was a category of wealthy peasants called the kulaks. They are not easily defined as national, ethnic, racial, or religious groups. They were a designated social class, and they were destroyed as such. So many of us have thought that we would like to see a broader definition of genocide. In my textbook, I have about 4.5 pages full of different definitions of genocide from the UN Convention that have been advanced by various scholars, including myself. But this remains the legal category. Now just look very briefly at those 5 strategies of genocide. A couple of things are notable here. First of all, unlike Lemkin, here we have killing members of the group placed at the very forefront of genocidal strategies. And for practical purposes under international law, it is extremely unlikely, I do not know of a case, where genocide has been, where perpetrators have been indicted for genocide or tried for genocide, except with the presence of large-scale, systematic mass killing of members of the targeted group. So killing members of the group is Article 2A, the primary genocidal strategy. But you notice that there are 4 other genocidal strategies also. Causing serious bodily or mental harm with the intent to destroy the group and undermine its physical existence. Article 2C, which is probably my favorite in terms of, if you can talk about a favorite aspect of genocide, but the phrasing is very interesting. Deliberately inflicting conditions of life on the group that undermine its physical viability. And that is getting us into the territory of more indirect or structural mechanisms of killing. You don't necessarily push people into gas chambers or put bullets in the back of their head, but let's say you send them off to a barren territory where they are unable to grow enough food to keep themselves alive. Think, for example, of the reservation experience for many indigenous people in the Americas. That kind of structural and indirect form of mass killing is also included in the Genocide Convention. You also have imposing measures to prevent births within the group, and this last one, where maybe we do get a bit of a sense of Lemkin's cultural and sociological framing, forcibly transferring children of the group to another group. That doesn't really make sense as a genocidal strategy unless you think that by transferring children and having them raised by members of another group, you are attacking the foundations of group identity and group cohesion. So we see a little residue, if you like, of Lemkin's original framing, but under the convention, and certainly the first three strategies listed in Article 2, there is emphasis upon the physical killing or severe physical violence being inflicted on members of the group with the intention of undermining its physical existence and viability. So that becomes the basis, really, for the post-World War II engagement with genocide and the emergence, eventually, of an academic field of study called comparative genocide studies, which has grown enormously over the past couple of decades since I first began exploring it. At the time, 20 years ago, it was a rather limited number of scholars. And what we see from the start in genocide studies is a couple of interesting themes. First of all, it must be the most interdisciplinary field of study that I am aware of. And in the textbook that I wrote on the subject, I tried to do justice to that quite extraordinary interdisciplinarity. I think there's a sense with genocide studies that it's kind of all hands on deck, that you can't let yourself be constrained by artificial academic specializations, by rivalries and backbiting. You need contributions from everywhere in order to understand this monstrous phenomenon, and, because this is key to genocide studies as well, to do something about it. We don't get into genocide studies as scholars just because we say, oh, that would be an interesting thing to study. First of all, it usually grabs us by the throat rather than us going out and seeking it. It's one of those topics that once it gets its hooks into you, it can be rather difficult to escape. What we get is the emergence, first of all, of a school built around historians, philosophers, theologians, a small number of anthropologists, psychologists, and that expands over time to include political scientists, sociologists, legal scholars continue to be very significant, gender scholars increasingly so, and we're today beginning to see the importance of contributions from the hard sciences or natural sciences as well, with the increasing emphasis on forensic work, for example, satellite remote sensing to uncover evidence of genocidal processes going on. Genocide studies very much grows out of studies of the Jewish Holocaust. This central event of the 20th century, this key event in the striking of the Genocide Convention and the popularizing of the term genocide. The Holocaust, I think, for many people has become the kind of iconic case of genocide. The central case, indeed, for a long time, there was a debate over whether it was a unique case of genocide in human history. That, again, is a complicated debate that we could spend the rest of the day talking about. I think you can gather, though, that if you have the emergence of something like a school of comparative genocide studies, it is not going to mesh well with an idea of historical uniqueness. Yes, all historical events are unique in their way, but if they are not comparable on some level, you really have trouble establishing a comparative school. And so genocide studies begins initially with mostly Jewish scholars of the Holocaust making the first attempts to compare the Jewish experience under the Nazis with other campaigns of mass persecution and mass physical destruction of populations. And the first case that they turn to for comparison purposes is the one that inspired Raphael Lemkin all the way back in the early 1920s, the Armenian genocide by the Ottoman Turks, in which the Armenian population, as you can see in this famous image from Harput in 1915, are rounded up by the authorities and either taken outside town to be massacred. That was the fate of Armenian men for the most part, and for the remaining members of the population, children, women, the elderly, sent off on these forced death marches to the Syrian desert. Many of the places, the place names that we hear today in the context of the Syrian civil war have been known to genocide scholars as sites of refugee encampments and large-scale mortality for the Armenian refugees. Roughly 1.5 million Armenians murdered directly or indirectly by the Ottoman Turks, who viewed them much the way the Nazis viewed the Jews, as an alien presence ethnically and religiously, as a subversive presence politically in alliance with the enemies of the state and so on, and with an outcome that was not precisely comparable to the Jewish Holocaust in terms of methods used, in terms of final death toll, percentage of the targeted population killed, etc., but which seemed comparable. And that kind of broke the taboo, I think, on comparative analysis. People started to look back into the history of their own countries, the history of the wider world, to try to find other examples of genocide throughout history and around the world at the time. The 1990s, I think, are a very important moment in the evolution of our thinking about genocide and the prominence of this concept. Because after the Genocide Convention was passed in 1948, genocide pretty much disappears from global affairs for several decades. The phenomenon itself, of course, does not disappear, but any kind of attempts to confront it or intervene in it or bring post facto justice in cases of genocide really slip to the back burner. To the extent that you have any trials for genocide, you have only national level trials, for example, in Ethiopia after the Derg regime. What we see in the 1990s with the end of the Cold War, this is another significant historical moment. And I think I've suggested that anti-genocide activists and scholars, going back to Lemkin, have always used these critical historical moments to try to advance the cause. End of the Cold War, people are thinking, great, everything's going to be peace and love and harmony now. We don't have these divisions between the superpowers. We can all cooperate, among other things, to confront mass atrocity crimes. And we see also, in the wake of the breakup of the USSR and the fall of communism, a disturbing range of outbreaks of mass atrocity, in many cases linked to the end of the Cold War and the superpower rivalry. So a great example of that, of course, is in the former Yugoslavia, the breakup of that federation, and the civil wars devolving into genocide, particularly against Bosnian Muslims by ethnic Serbs in the region. And this leads in 1995 to an event that you may well have heard of, the so-called Srebrenica massacre in Bosnia, where 8,000 Bosnian Muslim men and boys are massacred. This is at the tail end of a series of such smaller scale atrocities in the Bosnian wars that have already led to the creation of the so-called ad hoc tribunal, the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia. A sense that we now need international mechanisms of justice to actually intervene and bring justice to the perpetrators of these crimes. That's up and running in 1993. 1994, we get the astonishing events in Rwanda. And I think this particular case is significant from a Western world perspective in a couple of respects. First of all, I think it challenges very fundamentally any lingering notions of Holocaust uniqueness. Because although there are things that happened in the Holocaust but didn't happen in Rwanda, the reverse is also true. In Rwanda, you saw probably the fastest genocide on the historical record. Approximately 1 million people, overwhelmingly Tutsi, murdered in the space of 12 weeks in a tiny Central African country. That is about 5 times the killing rate of the Holocaust during the Second World War. An even larger percentage of the targeted group, Rwandan Tutsis, massacred. This killing was done in up-close and personal ways. You're all familiar, I'm sure, with the image of the machete related to Rwanda. The notion that we kind of carried over from the Holocaust, that you needed to create industrialized forms of killing so that the perpetrators would not be too psychologically traumatized by the killing that they were being asked to do. Well, here you see, up close and personal, neighbors killing neighbors, friends killing friends, sometimes even husbands killing wives. A mass popular involvement in the genocide, which was not a notable feature of the Nazi crimes, which were generally committed by a relatively small cohort of people, and to the eternal shame of the outside world, much as with the Srebrenica massacre, these crimes unfolded while the outside world did nothing. In both cases, there were extensive armed forces of peacekeepers present on the ground under United Nations auspices, and they either stood aside or devoted themselves, in the Rwandan case, to evacuating the white people. And once it was realized how extreme the scale and savagery of the killing had been, therefore, once it was realized how total and complete the abdication of responsibility had been for these crimes, that was a real wake-up call. And I think in genocide studies and in the world, wider world more generally, the lessons of Rwanda and to a lesser extent of the Balkans and Srebrenica are still reverberating with us. How can we stop this happening in the future? We have a second ad hoc criminal tribunal created after the Rwandan crimes. Hey, if you're going to have one for former Yugoslavia, how can you deny one in this African case? And those two tribunals together have been very important in helping to sharpen the applications of the Genocide Convention under international law and to bring it to the forefront of international justice for the first time. One other case of many others that I want to mention here is one that strikes closer to home and has been a wake-up call for our own country in a way that perhaps distant events in Rwanda and Yugoslavia, done by people whom we don't feel very much in common with in civilizational terms. Oh, they're not civilized, of course they're going to behave in that way. Genocide studies was stuck at that level for a long time, safely studying, I would say, psychologically safely, crimes that were distant, either historically or geographically, and were committed by cultures rather different from one's own. The question of genocides of indigenous peoples, however, had been very much at the forefront of Raphael Lemkin's thinking about genocide. He was one of the first Western scholars to really talk in depth about colonial crimes committed against Native people around the world, Australia, North America, Africa, and to incorporate this into his genocide framework, particularly his cultural and sociological understanding of genocide. And this is the reason I think today that we are seeing something of a return to Lemkin in genocide studies. Among other things, I think that reflects the unusual prominence of investigations and critiques of indigenous peoples' genocides in the field of genocide studies today, and a recognition that as indigenous people in our country and elsewhere view their own experience at the hands of Western forces, they similarly tend to interpret the destruction and devastation in cultural terms, linguistic terms, sociological terms, identity terms, not simply in the context of the large-scale physical mortality that was inflicted on those populations. But even if, like me, with my own preferred framing of genocide, which does follow the UN Convention in prioritizing mass killing, as we have come to understand more about, in particular, the residential school experience in Canada, which you'll be hearing more about today, we've come to understand the very substantial physical destruction that was involved here too. The kind of conditions that produced thousands of deaths, that led to children being released from the schools only when they were on the verge of death from malnutrition, from physical abuse, and from psychological dislocation. They would be returned to their families and communities so that they would die off the books, as it were. And this occurred on a large scale, particularly proportionate to the population that was being targeted. And this is the moment, I think, the engagement with genocides of indigenous peoples, where genocide scholars from the West, like myself, are forced into a position of turning the searchlight back upon ourselves and our own societies and our own cultures, and really asking ourselves what it is about the nature of our society, our culture, our attitudes, our political system, our legal system, which for so long has led to the marginalization and persecution and multifaceted destruction of the original inhabitants of this territory. Clearly, this is an ongoing process. We often discuss it today in terms of reconciliation with Aboriginal populations and Aboriginal heritage in our country. It is something that is going to continue to play out in your own lifetimes. But it is very important, I think, to move beyond a conception of genocide as something that happens over there and is done by evil people with whom, of course, we have nothing in common, and to look at the multifaceted forms of genocide, including in our own society. And one other thing that's noted there on the slide is that this also invites us to move beyond an understanding of genocide as a restricted historical event. Okay, there's disputes over whether we should class the Jewish Holocaust as lasting from 1933 to 45 or 1941 to 45. There's similar questions around the Armenian genocide. When do you date the beginning and the end? But everybody does come up with a beginning and an end. It is an event. How do we deal with processes of genocide that in the case of indigenous people may have been going on for hundreds of years and may have accomplished most of their destruction not through direct physical killing, but through, remember Article 2C of the Genocide Convention, creating conditions of life that over time undermine and destroy and sap the physical and cultural vitality of populations. So this has really brought us face to face with a broader view of genocide as a process rather than an event, and one that is often inflicted by indirect and structural means rather than up-close and direct mass killings. In my textbook, I try to do some justice to the interdisciplinary dimension of genocide by looking at various social science perspectives on this subject: sociology, anthropology, political science and international relations, gender studies. But the first chapter in that interdisciplinary section is titled The Psychology of Genocide. And I think I am more than ever convinced that while we do need to pay great attention to our political systems and arrangements, our cultural and sociological beliefs and stereotypes, at heart, we need to understand human psychology and the dark side of human psychology, but also the bright side of it, if we are to understand genocide and how we can prevent it and intervene in a holistic way. Because I think when we talk about intervening in genocide, probably our thoughts immediately go to peacekeepers and military forms of intervention and invasion. In many cases, by the time that happens, it's too late, or by the time people are talking about it, much genocidal destruction has already taken place. So how do we get to grips with the type of interventions that can help to inoculate individuals and societies against genocidal strategies, against the temptation of genocide? Because genocide can be a pretty tempting and at times even rational solution to political and social problems. By rational, of course, I don't mean morally acceptable, but it's not crazy people who are doing this. They're often doing it for particular rational aims. Underneath, I think, there are a range of psychological elements of our psyches that we need to get to grips with. And so I look at things like narcissism. I hope most of you have heard the word before, from the Greek god Narcissus, who fell in love with his own reflection. We're all in danger of falling in love with our own reflections. And I'm not talking about the selfie phenomenon these days. I'm talking about a natural human propensity to believe the best about ourselves, to assume that our motives are good and noble and pure, and also to apply that narcissism in a collective sense. A psychologist named Sam Vaknin has coined the term collective pathological narcissism. And he's referring to the way, for example, that individual countries and societies get caught up in a notion that we are the best, we are superior, we are civilized and they are not. We are good and generous and they are evil and subversive. And this uncritical approach to ourselves as individuals and relatedly to our own communities and collectivities and nation states as being somehow pure and untrammeled by original sin, if you like, is one of the reasons that we have this shock when somebody points out, hey, your society has been guilty of genocide also. How can you say that about Canadians? We're so nice. Aren't we nice? Compared to those evil Americans, for example? Don't we have a sense of ourselves, define ourselves as being somehow more peaceful, more calm, more cooperative? This is where you see that collective narcissism operating. We need to interrogate it. We need to recognize the way that it allows us to tell happy and comfortable stories to ourselves that just happen not to be true or not to be the whole truth. We need to understand the role of greed, which has been a factor in every genocide and which is part of the rationality of genocide, okay? Genocide offers an excellent opportunity for upward mobility and amassing resources. If you're going to murder the Jews of Europe, that is going to leave a lot of properties and belongings and positions in the bureaucracy or in academia that you can move into. And one of the regular phenomena that we see in genocide is that the initial attack on a population nearly always draws in the population at large as co-conspirators. And they are co-conspirators in particular for the ways that they seek to exploit the vulnerability and the suffering of the targeted group to take their jobs, to take their cattle, to take their wives, to take their resources, their homes, etc. This is one of the major means by which frustrated individuals who feel that life has not given them the breaks that they deserve are drawn into genocidal enterprises and made a very important critical mass assisting the authorities in that campaign. Fear of the other, fear of the outsider, the alien, fear of internal subversion, fear of having one's stable and comfortable life, if that's what you have, overturned and destroyed. And as we look again at the kind of propaganda that has always characterized genocide, we see genocidal perpetrators or would-be perpetrators playing on the fears of their subject populations. If you don't get these people first, they will get you. If we don't kill the Jews, if we don't kill the Armenians, if we don't kill the Tutsis, they will rise up and overwhelm you. And particularly in atmospheres of war and conflict, those fears are very easily able to be mobilized in emergency settings. And we need to be very aware of the way that those with evil designs on populations use fear as a way to make us forget our logic, forget our human sympathy and compassion and solidarity, and instead to scapegoat others and marginalize them and persecute them, all of the different steps on the road to a genocidal outcome. And as we look around the world today, I think we need to see the way that we are being primed every day with discourses of exclusion, discourses of superiority and inferiority, discourses of terrorism, discourses of xenophobia, all of the ways that our often unconscious fears are activated and we are made viable partners in a genocidal enterprise. And one thing that I'll mention that I've done a fair amount of research on that is often overlooked, psychological feelings of humiliation. It's very often the case that genocidal perpetrators themselves feel humiliated. Think about the Ottoman Turks in the threat of, in the context of the decline of the Ottoman Empire, invasion from multiple sides, the feeling of greatness lost. Think of the German population after the First World War. Afflicted by hyperinflation, a sense of national loss and indignity, the humiliation of the Versailles Treaty, etc. Think of the Hutus in Rwanda being raised always to believe that Tutsis were in fact a superior minority, more intelligent, more beautiful or handsome, etc., and walking around with a real chip on their shoulder that Hutu authorities are able to mobilize and say, finally it's time for you to get your own back against those Tutsis who've been humiliating you forever. That is a very important trigger to involvement in a genocidal enterprise, and it also helps us to understand one of the strange psychological things about genocide, which is, why don't perpetrators just kill their victims? Why do they generally put them through this torturous and humiliating phase before they are killed? And I think you have to understand the play of humiliation there to understand why it is important for perpetrators not just to exterminate their designated targets, but to bring them low, to cut them down to size, as it were, sometimes quite literally, as in the case of Rwanda. This imposing of humiliation reflecting long-standing and often subconscious feelings of humiliation within the perpetrator population. Fortunately, and so that I can end on a somewhat brighter note, we can also do very interesting studies of the psychology of rescuers. And I would really like you to keep this phenomenon in mind throughout the rest of your day today and in the breakout sessions, because we know that just as there are masses of people who are distressingly willing to be drawn on side to genocidal enterprises, there is also large numbers of people, unfortunately usually a minority of any given society, who refuse and who oppose and who seek to rescue vulnerable populations rather than collaborating in damaging or destroying them. And we have many examples of this throughout history. A couple of the more famous ones you see there, Raoul Wallenberg, who in Hungary at the end of the Second World War was personally responsible for saving thousands of Jews by providing them with Swedish diplomatic pseudo documentation. Paul Rusesabagina, if you've seen the movie Hotel Rwanda, for example, the head of the director of the Hotel des Mille Collines in Kigali, who likewise made his hotel a refuge for Tutsi victims. He was himself a Hutu, but nonetheless saved over 1,000 Tutsis from destruction. And quite a lot of psychological energy has gone into determining what it is about the values of these rescuers that has allowed them to go against the flow. While everyone else around them seems to be losing their minds and signing up with a genocidal enterprise, these rescuers resist. What is it that allows them to resist? First of all, what we see, I think, is that they have been raised in environments, family environments, school environments, religious environments, social environments that promote values like altruism, universalism, compassion, empathy, equity and egalitarianism, a sense of justice, a sense of mutual respect, an idea of fairness, benevolence, strength, autonomy, and independence, because how else are you going to swim against the tide unless you say, this is my decision to make, not other people's, and I am going to make it in a conscientious and justice-oriented way. And there may even be positive versions of patriotism, for example, where you say, a real German wouldn't do something like that. A real Canadian would not be involved in these kind of atrocities. So as we move through the day today, let's keep some of these core values which have been isolated in the psychology of rescuers rather than perpetrators of genocide, and ask ourselves on a number of levels, I propose 3 different levels, what can we do to make those values more of a powerful presence in the world and a powerful obstacle to the type of dynamics and psychological processes that drive people and drive societies towards genocide. In the breakout sessions that I'll be leading, I will ask you to brainstorm about what can be done on the level of individual human beings like yourselves, individuals also as members of families. What about on a national and societal level? How do we ensure that our countries, our national units are as well inoculated as possible to genocidal processes and temptations? And what do we need to do on an international and global level to finally stage an effective intervention in genocide that will allow us to say something along the lines of what we're able to say, for example, about legalized international slavery today? There's a great example of an institution that was deeply embedded in human history, sanctioned by numerous religions, and yet in the space of just a few decades went from being broadly accepted by the world to being one of the major international crimes. The same sort of thing clearly can be done in the case of genocide, but we're not there yet. And it is going to be a struggle that will be consuming me for the rest of my lifetime and for your hopefully much longer lifetimes as well, to finally bring an end to this scourge and to realize Raphael Lemkin's dream of a world in which diverse people and societies are able to live in coexistence and with mutual respect and compassion, as opposed to envy and rivalry and mutual destruction. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much, Dr. Jones. We're now going to take a 10-minute break. In the Friesen Center, you're going to find that there's some orange cake. There's a really remarkable story about that orange cake. You can read that in your program. So the time right now is 9:47. If everyone could be back in their seats at 9:57 right here, we're going to move on to the second part of the program. Thank you. That's okay. It's important lessons. So. Well, yeah, we can make up the time in other places.